I think it's important early on in the conversation, we zoom in on weight gain and obesity and talk about what happens there classically. And then we'll flip into keto and when somebody switches their metabolism, how they can walk their way out of it.
Sure. So when someone, let's say they're in their younger years, they have never had a problem with weight before, although that's becoming actually not uncommon to see people developing obesity in childhood. Actually, I was someone who did about 2 decades ago. But when someone starts to consume more calories than their body is expending, their body begins to store the excess nutrients they're not burning on their own body, right? So you start to store that predominantly in fat, because fat is the one area of the body where you can store excess tissue almost in theory to no upper limit, right? You've all heard of examples of individuals up towards of 400, 500 plus pounds. And that 400, 500 plus pounds is not muscle, obviously. That's overwhelmingly fat. And that fat is being stored in excess because our body is extremely good at doing that. And it's extremely good at doing that because of our history. Our history as a species went through feast and famine. And when we went through famine, we needed excess storage of nutrients when we couldn't get food. And the best way to store that was in the form of fat. Well, unfortunately, our culture has evolved at such a rapid rate where our genetics have not caught up with that same evolutionary rate. And as a result, our bodies are prepared to constantly store nutrients in anticipation of famine that we never experience anymore. We're constantly over-consuming, and our body is constantly placing that excess abundance of calories on our body and storing it predominantly as fat. Now, when someone gains excess fat beyond, let's say, a normal healthy level on the body, that's when we start to see early changes of things like insulin. This is one of the first things that changes. So insulin starts to elevate when people get into and creep into levels of obesity, usually around doubling and up to, typically insulin will about double, sometimes quadruple when people go from normal body weight to getting into a classification of obesity. Now, it's not just insulin though. We also know that there's excess amounts of amino acids and lipids that are now floating around the blood. So a lot of people call type 2 diabetes energy toxicity, which is the extreme end of this, but it's true. You're seeing an abundance of not just glucose that drives insulin higher, but also amino acids, also lipids. And there's also some other changes in things like inflammatory signals and oxidative stress signals. And so pretty early on, even the early onset of obesity, we see elevated insulin, early signs of insulin resistance, around a 33 to 36% reduction in insulin sensitivity in the muscle and a whole body. And then as people progress further and further into obesity, before they even see elevations in blood glucose levels, insulin levels can go up sixfold. Their insulin resistance can go up to 75 to 80% in the muscle and whole body tissues. And all of these other biomarkers we're describing, the amino acids, the lipids, inflammation, oxidative stress signals, they're also rising as well. And so we're seeing this composite change with obesity just because of the excess adipose tissue that is being stored in the body. And it is at that point where when multiple years of that persist, that the body can no longer maintain that level of excess homeostasis. And as a result, the blood sugar levels begin to rise. So this is when we start to see the incidence of something called prediabetes, where blood glucose levels can no longer be maintained in the normal range anymore. And as a result, they start to rise, but they only start to rise after years of these changes happening under the surface. And that's really the consequence of obesity. It isn't just a superficial thing when you look in the mirror or how people look at you. It's actually something that's happening under your skin, in your cells and in your blood.
Well, let's take it down to the cells and talk about changes there. How much of this growth or putting on tissue, in this case fat tissue, are cells getting bigger versus multiplying? And then let's talk about different fat deposits in different areas of the body, whether it be visceral fat, liver fat. We've been talking about it in a general sense, but let's really break it down.
So great question. So actually we'll take that in reverse order and talk about where the fat gets deposited. So initially when people start to begin to gain weight, they start to begin to gain weight in these peripheral tissues. like the leg and other regions. But there becomes a point where people start to gain excess amounts of weight in the general central region of the body. Now, people may wonder, why does that matter? Well, that's something called visceral fat. And visceral fat has been associated with many health consequences, but it's the deposition of fat in the central part of the body, which has been linked to many health consequences. But it's also linked to insulin resistance and a number of biological changes that is pushing your metabolism in the wrong direction. Now, when it comes to the other question you pose, which is what's happening with these cells or these fat cells? Well, there was a prevailing theory. Obviously, the fat cells are enlarging, right? So there's something called lipohypertrophy, or the hypertrophy means growth, or growth in size. People think of hypertrophy typically in the context of muscle, but it also applies to fat as well. And lipo means fat, so fat growth. And these grow, but there's also a prevailing belief that these cells grow to a point, and then they separate, divide into individual new adipocytes, and then those grow. So you're actually growing not only the size, but also the number. And then as people start to go into a deficit, there's also a belief that now you have more fat cells lingering around. And as a result, as more fat cells shrink, more counter-regulatory hormones are released to trigger your brain to think you're in a state of starvation. And that state of starvation triggers your brain to want to feed more. So this is where the biological mechanisms arise that say, hold on, we had all this excess adipose tissue and now it's all shrinking. We don't want that. And generally speaking, from an evolutionary perspective, we would not want that. But we don't live in the same state that our body evolved in. We live in a place of abundance where very few people ever go into a state of famine for more than 24 hours without food. And as a result, your body's constantly in a state of abundance. And this is where you find individuals gaining a ton of weight, and then you also find them struggling once they gain that weight to bring it off. This is why it's obviously, they say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This is the case not just in scenarios like smoking is the best example, where if you stop smoking in the first place, you can prevent so many other problems down the road. Same thing with obesity. It tends to be much easier if you can prevent its onset in the first place than try to reverse it once it's initiated. But unfortunately, 90%. So there's two statistics here. There's one at Tufts University at 88% and UNC, University of Chapel, North Carolina, Chapel Hill at 93%, showing that around basically 9 out of 10 Americans have some type of metabolic dysfunction or biomarkers shifting in the wrong direction. Meaning that if we were to go to United States of America, look around in a room, we have 10 adults in the room, 9 out of 10 of them on the average would have either an elevated waistline, an elevation in blood glucose levels, adverse changes in elevation in lipids like triglycerides, or one of these other biological biomarkers that we know are associated with health that are going in the wrong direction. And that's almost every adult in the United States. So we know this isn't an uncommon thing. When people think, well, what should the healthy person do? Well, that's an odd question to ask nowadays because that's actually the exception. It's not, that's definitely the exception, not the rule. And so a lot of what we talk about nowadays is what can we do to improve the health of the entire nation, which most people contend are largely sick or on their way to developing some type of chronic metabolic condition.
I want to zoom back a couple of minutes and highlight something you brought up there. The fact that our fat has a memory and will pull us back towards wanting to gain weight if we've been at a weight for a certain period of time. Talk more about the nuance there. How long do we have to be overweight to have that physiological effect? And then for somebody that applies what we're talking about today, brings the weight down, gets metabolically healthy, does their metabolism and new balance of their body weight ever reset?
That's a great question. So what we're referring to is like a metabolic set point. So this idea of this, are you shifting the point at which your body feels normal or at a neutral place? And I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know if we know that answer today. I don't know if we know the answer by which every individual person, as they progress through, why we see individual differences between some individuals who are very predisposed to not only gaining weight, but not able to reverse that weight. Because we've always met that one person who could consume an abundance of calories and never worry about this. And then there's other people who look at food. The joke is they just look at food and they gain weight. So there's these huge biological differences of which we don't totally completely understand why that is the case. Although we do know that there are some key metabolic changes. For example, there's a hormone called leptin that got a lot of appreciation over the years because that's one of those hormones that actually, as the adipose tissue shrinks, is released and triggers hunger in the brain. In fact, we actually did studies when I was working with a clinical physiologist who actually looked at leptin and actually found some rare genetic disorders of leptin deficiency. And these individuals would be hungry all the time, meaning they were no longer able to produce leptin within the body, and as a result, they were never feeling satisfied. Okay, and as a result, then they administer a drug called metroleptin. Okay, this is a very expensive drug. I'm pretty sure it's not largely approved, but when it was administered, they lost an abundance of weight, a huge amount of weight. But this is a very rare thing that occurs, but it's an illustration of unique hormonal metabolism or hormone-induced changes in hunger signaling, where things like leptin, as a response to shrinkage of adipose tissue, can drive hunger. But it's not the only molecule that does this, right? We know that typically when fat cells shrink, there's also shrinking because insulin's also lower. Well, when insulin's lower, that sets off a cascade of changes within the body. Arguably, I would contend that insulin is the most powerful hormone in all metabolism. And when it goes high, it causes changes in virtually every major tissue in the body. And when it comes low, it does the same thing and actually tends to regulate other tissue or other hormones like glucagon. And so as insulin goes higher, we know that it stores fat. As it goes lower, it frees up the ability for fat to be broken down and utilized as a fuel source. And so there's quite a lot of things that are happening, but the exact reason why someone would get to a set stage and then find it difficult once they lose weight or what their set point is, let me get to that. That was something that was being proposed. Well, I actually don't know the original data was proposed. I know there was theories being proposed upwards of over a decade ago as to why that was the case. But I'm not sure that we have the exact answer to that, unfortunately, today.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
I was a fat kid growing up. I had obesity as a kid. I failed for over half a decade on all these various diet strategies, and I eventually found success with reliably and sustainably changing my diet.